Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you at the screen, and I hope it's the last time that we will have to meet on screen. The coffee break between the presentations with the very useful talks is missing, and also the Prosecco after the meeting. So we have to do away with it for the time being. But I heard that there are 40 participants at the screen, and I think it's a remarkably high number. And I want to point out that we have 3 country reports today from Ukraine. It's the first country from outside of the EU that we are discussing, Estonia and Bulgaria. Before Mr. Hilpolt will take over the moderation of the meeting today, I would like to hand the floor to Mrs. Lehmann, who gratefully has said she's prepared to greet us. She has been, since 1990, politically active for the Social Democrats in Germany, and for 3 mandates she was present in the Brandenburg parliament for her party since 2002. She is a member of the German parliament and a member of the Interior Committee for Homestead, and now she is a reporter for the National Autochthonous Minorities and is supporting an application for the Minority Safeback initiatives. And Mrs. Lehmann, many thanks for being ready to give us a greeting. Many thanks for the kind welcome. Dear Mrs. Penches, dear Mr. Kronhäuser, dear speaker, dear listeners, and not least Mr. Roblek. It's a great honor for me to be able to give the welcome address at the Joint Congress of the Cultural Foundation of German Expellees and FUN on the topic of minority protection and ethnic group rights in Central and Eastern Europe. I thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity. The topic of autochthonous national minorities in Germany and Europe has occupied me like no other in the last 2 years. Minority policy must be approached as an active peace policy. In a growing community of states like the EU, which is based on common values such as the rule of law, democracy, human rights. This means unreserved commitment to the protection of minorities. There are over 50 million persons belonging to national minorities in the EU. 1 in 8 EU citizens either belongs to a minority or speaks a minority language. In addition to 24 official languages, there are around 60 regional and minority languages. The Council of Europe, with 47 European and neighboring states, speaks of 230 indigenous languages and language groups. Unfortunately, the preservation and promotion of cultural and linguistic diversity, effective protection of the rights of national minorities and their equal participation in society are not a matter of course, even within the European Union. And this despite the fact that all this is guaranteed by the European Constitution. Since my first conversation with the FUN, I have therefore been unreservedly committed to the implementation of the European Citizen Initiative Minority Safe Pack and initiated a motion within the coalition calling on the federal government to advocate the MSPI at the European level. This motion was unanimously adopted by the German Bundestag. The majority of the members of the European Parliament also approved an analogous resolution, despite the resolutions at the EU, the member states and the parliamentary levels, the EU Commission refused to initiate a legislative procedure. At my request, Brandenburg's Minister President Dietmar Woidke forwarded a supportive letter to the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, calling on her to reconsider the Commission's decision. After all, the MSPI is about creating common European standards. They concern the preservation of diversity, cultural and linguistic protection, including promotion of the development of a European language center and support programs for small language communities. The inclusion of minorities in the European Regional Development Fund, the equality of stateless national minorities. As it overrides a decision of the European Parliament, the Commission's decision is difficult to understand. I therefore support the FUN in its action for annulment. This is altogether the third action brought by FUN under the MSPI and the second against the EU Commission. In the coming week, there will be a discussion on this Commission decision within the framework of the Interior Committee of the German Bundestag, in which the Minorities Advisory Council, the representatives of the national minorities in Germany, the FUN and the rapporteurs of the Bundestag will participate. An implementation of the MSPI would counteract a certain European double standard, because with common standards, the high level of protection of minorities would not only be demanded of the states that want to join the EU, but also those that are already members. New EU states would be required to maintain minority protection after their accessions. In the long run, the Copenhagen dilemma could be minimized or resolved. Dear ladies and gentlemen, before I close and wish you all a productive Congress, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the Minority Secretariat is preparing an exhibition of the autochthonous national minorities. It is to be opened in the German Bundestag in the coming election period and will travel throughout the country as a traveling exhibition. In this way, we also want to make the majority population aware of the richness and the different situations of the Danes, the Frisians, the Low German language group, the Sorbs, and the Sinti and Roma. Science, education and enlightenment are the important steps towards acceptance and appreciation. As the responsibility umbrella organization with operational responsibility, I would like to once again express my respect to FUN for their great work it has done in the framework of the Minority Safeback Initiative. And have a look. Policy can only implement goals with strong and reliable partners. FUN has proven to be such a partner, and for this I thank it very much. I will conclude with a quote that also introduced my speech to the German Bundestag. They are the words of the former Danish Parliament Speaker, Eva Hansen. I quote, "Tell me how minorities are treated in your country, and I will be able to tell you what kind of state you live in." Thank you for your attention and have an informative and successful meeting. Many thanks, Mrs. Lehmann, for your welcoming words, and thank you for taking the time for us, and also thank you for your initiative. And I hope you will stay with us, and we will do so as well. And perhaps you can follow our meeting a little bit. We would be happy, and I'm very happy now to introduce Mr. Hilpold. I don't have to introduce him. I think everybody knows him, but he's a great expert in the area of minority protection in Europe. And now he will take over the moderation of the meeting. Mr. Hilpold, the floor is yours. Many thanks, Mr. Gornick, for the invitation. Mr. Kornhäuser and Roblek. I welcome all participants. It's a great honor for me to moderate this meeting. And well, I think in the last meeting, I also was a speaker, was a presenter. Now I'm on the other side. And perhaps I can also take over this creative and regulatory position and moderate the panels. We start with the country reports regarding Estonia, and in this context, Mr. Petai will speak, and also Mrs. Ermakov. We have strict time limits, and they were communicated to me, and I can only pass them on. We have a very tight program, and we have to make sure that the time slots will adhere to and not extended. And therefore, I would like to ask to get started immediately with the presentation of Mr. Professor Mr. Verio Petai, high-ranking expert of minority issues and policy. Mr. Petai is a director of ECMI, Business Center for Minority Affairs in Flensburg, Germany, and he's also a professor of comparative politics at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And he was an advisor to the president of Estonia on minority issues and published widely on ethnopolitics in the Baltic region. He's currently working. Yes, and you have the floor, Mr. Petai.
Gut, herzlichen Dank. Erstmal auf Deutsch. Также хочу на русском языке радоваться нашему мероприятию сегодня. But I'm going to continue in English because the European Center for Minority Issues is an international research center for the study of minority issues. And before I continue with the presentation, I, of course, would like to thank both FUEN and the Kulturstiftung for organizing today's event. And as you see, I will try to give you a brief look into the regulatory framework for then minority protection in Estonia. And then what I would like to do is then outline the following, namely speak a little bit about the minority situation in Estonia as such. It's a little bit particular in comparison to many other countries in Europe. Then secondly, look into the regulatory framework, as promised, constitutional provisions as well as policy infrastructure. And last but not least, then address the central foci that are at the heart of this event, namely the education, political participation, and use of minority language in public life. So briefly, just about the ethnic composition of Estonia as it currently stands. And you see that Estonians make up roughly 70% of the population. And when we speak about minorities, then the vast majority is constituted by ethnic Russians. And together with a small slice, as you see literally, of Ukrainians and Belarusians, as a result of which in Estonia, very often people speak about the so-called Russian-speaking population because of the linguistic similarities of those three Slavic minorities. Be that as it may, you see that this is the vast majority of the minority population as such. And in particular, of course, it is coming from a country neighboring Estonia, which is rather large, and with which Estonia has had somewhat complicated relationships over the decades. And certainly in the 20th century. So there is all of that a part of the minority situation in Estonia. And in addition, I want to stress that this minority as such, you see, is relatively new. And of course, this needs not to be overstressed because human rights and minority rights are in many respects universal. But nevertheless, this is in the ethno-political discussion, of course, it is also always noted that the minority is very much a product of the Soviet period. Most of the minority, the Russian-speaking minority, developed after 1945. So as a point of comparison, in 1945, Estonia was roughly 97% Estonian. And now you see the proportions are very different. And this in turn has led to a third sort of point of reference here, which is citizenship, because after Estonia reestablished its independence, there was controversy over how to establish citizenship in the country. And Estonia ultimately decided to reestablish the citizenship of those who were citizens in 1940. And their descendants and all those who came in the Soviet period were not given automatic citizenship, but rather were asked to naturalize. And this means that, as you can see, a lot of people in Estonia have either opted for Russian Federation citizenship or, in fact, have remained stateless, as funny as that may sound these days. So we can get into those details later on. But in fact, the proportion of overlap between minority population and non-citizens is actually very large, and therefore roughly half of the minority population is also either Russian Federation citizens or stateless people. So these are three very important, I think, differences and things to keep in mind when considering minorities in Estonia. Nevertheless, the Estonian constitution adopted in 1992 included a number of important provisions concerning minorities. First and foremost, of course, Article 49, you see explicit right to the preservation of ethnic identity. Secondly, we're going to talk about this briefly, is the fact that Estonia revived a tradition of national cultural autonomy and enacted that with the 1993 legislation. So this harks back to same kind of practice from the 1920s that Estonia had. Of course, Estonia has relevant provisions about non-discrimination and anti-incitement of hatred. And then in particular, relating to cultural rights, there is the right to minority language education. And we can talk about the extensive Russian language schooling that exists in Estonia and the problems, however, also associated with it. And then very interestingly, and particularly for Estonia, there are minority language rights provisions for local administrations in which more than half of the population is of minority background. And these things are regulated, although they have not been implemented. So we can talk about that as a problem later on. And last but not least, given the citizenship issues that I mentioned beforehand, there are provisions in the Constitution that allow all permanent residents to vote in local elections. So this is one additional detail. So briefly about the policy provisions, what we have as an infrastructure for these rights in the Constitution and elsewhere. First and foremost was the existence of a Minister for Population Affairs for about 12 years. Who actually guided the process that you see in the second point, namely the integration policy. So Estonia has built up since the late 1990s a infrastructure for integration policy, for minority policy, for supporting minority cultural associations, and doing public relation campaigns and whatnot. So this has been around. It was interrupted for a few years, but it continues today under relevant ministries. So there is some good news, if you will. And finally, let me address these the three foci that were asked of me. And namely, if we talk about political participation of minorities, it of course all begins with citizenship. So clearly those 12% of the population and who are almost exclusively of minority background, to the extent that they have no citizenship, they do not vote in national elections, they cannot be members of political parties, they're not eligible for national civil service employment. However, they can vote, and they do vote in local elections. So there's a little bit of political clout, a little bit of political participation on that level, but it is limited to about the half of the minority population that actually has citizenship. Secondly, and partly because of perhaps the first idea, there is no ethnic party in Estonia, many Russians do support a particular Estonian party called the Center Party, but we do not have a kind of ethnic party that you see, for example, in Romania or in other countries. And this cultural autonomy system that I mentioned has been fully established and partly implemented for very small groups like Ingrians and others, but for larger minority groups, it is not very practical simply to establish these electoral rolls and create these councils. Certainly for the ethnic Russian minority, it has proved relatively dysfunctional. So this has been a disappointment in some respects. On the education and teaching front, the Russian language education system is extensive in Estonia, primarily because of the, if you will, legacies of the Soviet system in the Soviet Union. Of course, there was extensive Russian language schooling developed in Estonia, certainly as the minority grew larger and larger and larger. This includes everything from kindergartens all the way to high schools and secondary education. However, in the last 15, 20 years, the Estonian government has attempted to increase the level of Estonian language lessons in these schools, especially at the higher grades in the secondary education, in order to prepare minority school children for the job market and university, etc., etc. So this is problematic. Controversy over what percentage of Estonian language lessons should be done and how. It's still an ongoing process, so that's one flag to raise. And lastly, the use of minority language in public life. Indeed, these local language rights that I outlined from the Constitution have yet to be fully implemented. Several local governments in northeast Estonia, where many Russians then live and where the vast majority or half of the Russian population lives, have asked the Estonian government to formally apply these rules and allow them to run local administration also in Russian. And the government has consistently rejected those applications and has claimed that first and foremost, these governments have to ensure Estonian language use. So this is a sticking point, a controversy. It's dragging on from year to year, but of course clearly limits the use of minority language in public life in those local governments where Russians do constitute a majority. So I will stop there, I think exactly in my 10 minutes allotted, and we'll look forward to possible comments and questions later on.
Yeah, vielen Dank.
Many thanks, Mr. Professor Petai. Also, thank you for taking your time and keeping to the time. And I would propose that we can ask questions, maybe spontaneously, if there is a question of understanding. Otherwise, I would like to leave to this discussion for the end of the meeting. Yes. And if there is no immediate question, then that cannot be postponed. Then I would like to continue with Mrs. Ermankov, the president of the ethnic minorities. Mrs. Ermankov is from Moldavia, is an ethnic scientist, and is president of the ethnic minority. She was for 17 years the head of the Estonian Moldovan Society. Furthermore, she is the founder of the head of the National Minorities Working Group of the Estonian Folklore Council. She holds a PhD from Tallinn University and has been involved in both cultural and scientific activities of different peoples, especially the Finno-Ugric, for many years. Mrs. Ermakov, you have the floor. It's a great honor for me to be able to participate in this conference, and I thank you for the invitation, and I can share my experiences when it comes to the implementation of minority rights on the practical sphere. I belong to a national minority living in Estonia. My people are called the Ersia, and I often introduce myself as a resident of Estonia with Ersia roots. To me, this sounds very dignified. I moved to Estonia 22 years ago as part of an indigenous people program. I studied here, and I think I've integrated well. My personal experience and many other examples of public life and work show that there are all the rights for minority representatives in Estonia that are necessary to integrate into Estonian society and feel equal. Of course, there have been difficulties, but if there is the desire and the help offered to national minorities are used, then any problem can be solved. Apart from the Estonians themselves, almost 200 different peoples live in Estonia. In all democratic countries in the world, the rights of minorities are protected by national laws and international agreements. The Constitution says everyone has the right to respect for his nationality. Estonia has signed the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and in order to save their culture, these ethnic groups organize themselves in cultural association. By 2020, there are already 300. In 89, there were only 29. Most of them belong to an umbrella organization, such as the Federation of Pupils of Estonia. The Finns have been organized under the Act of the Cultural Autonomy of National Minorities since 2004. The Swedes since 2007. Now I come to the first point of content, the political participation of national minorities. The state creates the conditions for representatives of national minorities to preserve and develop their culture and characteristics. This includes religion, language, traditions, and the cultural heritage of peoples. Various forums, roundtables, and conferences are held annually for this purpose. Our society is hierarchically structured. Everyone can develop his or her potential because the connection to the state is simple and direct. Thus, national minorities have been able to approach the parliament several times with various issues and received support or advice. Citizens of Estonia and the EU can vote in local elections. Foreigners living in Estonia with permanent resident permits or settlement permits are also allowed to vote in elections to local self-government bodies. In 2018, the development of a new integration plan entitled Integration of Estonia 2030 began. There were consultations with relevant ministries and partners, including representatives of cultural associations and national minorities. And my colleagues and I also had several opportunities to participate in the development plan, in the development of the plan, excuse me. The most important topics are communication with the state, contacts among communities, solving economic issues, better learning of Estonian language, etc. I'm pleased to start this topic by saying that according to PISA, Estonia has the best school education in Europe. The number of students in Russian schools is about 21,000 students. In the school year 2020-21, Russian is the language of instruction in 77 schools, of which 55 schools both have both Estonian and Russian, and 22 schools teach only Russian. In 4 schools, the language of instruction is English, and in 4 other schools, Estonian and English is being taught. There's also 1 school with Estonian and Finnish, and 1 with English and French. There are also a number of Sunday schools for minorities, coordinated by the Ministry of Education. They provide instruction in the mother tongue, but also in history and national culture for learners who cannot learn this in their general education system. Such schools can apply for funding. In 2020, the learning of Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian, Georgian, Tatar, Azerbaijani, Finnish, Latvian, Kabardin, Korean, Uzbek, Mari, Arabic and Belarusian was promoted in this way. Any community wishing to establish its own Sunday school can apply to the state for funding. In 2020, a Roma language and culture school was established for the first time. The Roma dialect spoken in Estonia does not exist in written form, and until 2020, the Roma had no opportunity to be supported in learning their own language. Estonia also supports the preservation of the language and culture of historical national minorities through regional measures. For example, the culture of the Russian Old Believers. Festivals can be held, information about cultural heritage can be provided, and cultural summer camps for children can be organized. In Estonia, there are no restrictions for different ethnic and racial groups to participate in cultural life. All national minorities can apply for funding for their associations and have equal rights with Estonian cultural associations. In addition, the state finances the activities of cultural associations of national minorities through various programs for the preservation of language, traditions and cultural heritage. This is done through the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Education, the Integration Fund, the Estonian Center of National Culture, the Estonian Culture Fund and the Civil Society Fund, as well as through the local government bodies. The EU structural funds also support the cultural work of national minorities. What about the use of minority languages in social life? Regardless of the proportion of different ethnic groups in any region, national minorities can use their mother tongue in communication with representatives of the civil service and local government, for notaries, court employees, and sworn translators and interpreters, if both parties agree. State institutions and local government bodies make efforts to provide information in different languages. Most have websites, not only in Estonian, but also in Russian and English. All ministries and agencies have websites in Russian and English. So most important information is also available in these languages. Last year, a roundtable of national minorities held online. The former Ministry of Culture offered to use whatever language was most comfortable to those present when talking to him. The choice of language is also taken into account, or it takes the needs of national minorities in the work of local self-government bodies. And there is also it's used in the health service with the police and the bodies of self-government wherever the share of the Russian population is high. Russian TV channel ETV Plus is very popular, as are Russian language newspapers and news portals, Radio 4 broadcasts in Russian, Azerbaijani, Tatar and Chuvash. During the pandemic, the different electronic services could be adapted to the situation very quickly. This is a positive example of the ability to adapt and integrate. In the lockdown, necessary contact information, for example, for consultations in different languages, was collected and disseminated on social media, website, etc. The Ministry of Health also offered electronic awareness programs and in trilingual counseling. Of my time is almost over, and I would like to say that we are very grateful for our long-standing cooperation with FUN. We consider this cooperation is indispensable, and the experiences and recommendations have served our experts and policymakers very well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ermakov. I know that 10 minutes is a short time, but still, we could get information, and you can convey information in a 10 minutes presentation. So that is rather positive. So now we would like to discuss about this presentation. And we also have 2 questions. Mr. Borislav, can you please be as brief as possible in your question or in your statement, please? 1 minute maximum. Mr. Borislav, you have the floor. Good afternoon. My name is Borislav. I work at a Russian school in Estonia. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for comments, but very briefly, what we have to say, we don't see the situation as wonderful as just has been presented by the Professor Natalia. I think we have serious problems in Estonia, which has partly been admitted by the previous speakers. We've heard about the constitutional problems because things don't work as they should for the Russian minority. That is a fact, unfortunately. As far as the schools are concerned and the possibility of Russian teaching, the possibility is decreasing. There are fewer and fewer opportunities, and the curriculum of the Russian teaching should be abolished altogether by 2030. So we cannot welcome this trend. And I think there is a negative feeling among the Estonian population against the Russian minorities. And Mr. Peter said that Russians came from Russia to Estonia. This is not really true because a large number of the Russians living in Estonia have been living in Estonia for a long time in the second and third generation. And it's not correct to say that people came from Russia to Estonia more recently. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Korsakov. Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear friends. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that we do have serious problems with national minorities in Estonia. And first of all, I have to say, those people who have been working as a person, have been working as an ombudsman for the last 10 years, and I have always been, a colleague of mine has also been imprisoned for his activities in favor of the Russian minorities. So just for them representing a minority such as the Russian minority, we risk going to prison. As far as the languages are concerned, there is a legislation, but the Russians are being oppressed. Of course, the banks are interested in making sure that they can speak, that the customers can speak the languages. You could even speak Chinese for that matter. But if it were for a representation of the Russian minority in Estonia, very often in public authorities, there are no Russian speakers at all. Or, for example, if you write an application in Russian, you are possibly going to get an answer in Estonian, or they can even tell you that you should have written your application in Estonian and not in Russian. Thank you very much for Mr. Rosakov. I think this has been a valuable compliment, and I am sure that the both speakers are going to answer to these questions. Well, I'm going to start with the first speaker, Mr. Pedri. Can you say something about this?
Thank you very much. Thank you for both of those comments. I think that they do point to several things that remain to be worked on and resolved in Estonia. I think that the question of Russian language schooling in Estonia, as many of you know, has been going on for quite a long time in Estonia, ever since re-independence in the early 1990s. This is a question of course, some integration, finding the balance between some kind of Estonian language instruction, because it doesn't appear from just anywhere, alongside the protection of minority linguistic and educational rights. This is an ongoing discussion and debate. And then concerning the question of language rights, this is, of course, opens the discussion of what are the official languages in Estonia? Should there be second official languages? Or is there some kind of middle ground, which is, I think, in the constitution, that speaks about other language policies in areas where there are a majority of non-Estonian residents? So this is the kind of front that I see people, Estonia, need to work on, to figure out, and to get the political capital and courage to actually implement. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to ask Mr. Amakov now to answer to the previous questions. Thank you very much for this question and for the comments. Of course, in every country there are problems, and if you are talking about the Russian-speaking population, a minority, I believe that I did tell you the true information, the facts which I know about. I work in a hospital, and I'm not retired, and I am asked by the medical doctor, which is your preferred question? Do you prefer to speak in Russian or Estonian? So it doesn't always work out that well. That is true. So we have to continue working, and we have to do something about it. But nevertheless, it is a fact that there are 77 schools where Russian is taught and spoken. There are Russian-speaking newspapers and websites and cultural centers and Sunday schools. So they do exist. So that's what I saw and realized. So I can tell you that it's true. And I'm talking about partners I've been cooperating with. But of course, it's a complex matter, and maybe there are Estonians who are unwilling to speak Russian. We have further demands for the floor. Now, the question is now, how does it work the other way around? The Russian influence on the Russian minority. This is a difficult question, which you may not only be relevant to Estonian. Does Russia as a country support its minorities outside Russia? Can you see this in Estonia? Is this influence being tolerated if it comes from Russia, or does it have certain limits or reservations? Does Estonia reject any interference of Russia for its Russian minority in Estonia. Can you start first, please?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's a very evident question, a very important question. It has evolved over the years. Of course, in the 1990s, Russia has always, of course, expressed its concern about the status and well-being of the Russian minority in Estonia. But in the 1990s, it was more reserved, and certainly it was not direct in terms of interfering or attempts to interfere in Estonia's internal affairs. Whereas in the middle of the 2000s, things changed a little bit, not least because of the so-called Bronze Soldier incident in Estonia, in which the Estonian government moved an old Soviet statue, and this caused 2 days of riots in Tallinn. And it was discussed then that Russia attempted to also send activists over the border to participate in those events and stage cyber attacks against Estonia. Again, I don't want to go into the details, but that, and then of course the third sort of stage, if you will, or element of change is after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, which really also worried Estonians very much. So there is no direct influence as such, but the actions of Russia over the years have been very worrisome. And I think the last point I would simply add is the influence of Russian Federation media that is widely consumed in Estonia. So as that media has itself gone downhill and become less open and free, that information flows also into Estonia as it does to many other places. But in our context, it also constitutes a certain amount of concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. As there, Mr. Borislav wanted to make a short statement about this matter, but please be as brief as possible, half a minute only. Well, just very briefly, Mr. Petter said that a balance has to be found between the various interests. But unfortunately, no one tries to find a balance. The way we see it, the situation until 2030 will be difficult for the Russian minority. I think that the Russian language is going to get lost in 8 years' time. So if you see this curriculum for the Estonian schools, then you realize that everything will have to be taught in Estonian and by 2030. That is one point. Another point, I don't believe it is true to get a connection between the international policy of Russia and the situation of Estonia. I don't think that these two things are connected. If you blame international relationships of Russia with other countries, then we can also say what happens in the United States also has an influence on Estonia. So I think international politics is a different matter, and we should not be taken into account here. There certainly is a Russian phobia, a phobia against Russian, and the Russian country doesn't have to do with it. Thank you very much. I think we have had several interesting comments. We see that there are contrary viewpoints, so we have to respect this. I don't think we should continue on this way in this discussion. Mrs. Yujashenko, maybe just very briefly, if you want to take the floor. I don't want to cut anyone's speech. Thank you very much for this question. I agree that the problem is very complex and very difficult. I am a Russian citizen. I have a permanent residence permit in Estonia, and I look after cultural relationship. Well, Moldova is in Russia, and I do believe that we should maintain the relationships we have to the Russian country. So this is something we look after. We look after ourselves, and it doesn't concern the international relationships. So I think that's a political matter, and it's completely different. Thank you very much for this statement. The problem is large and complicated, but I think we got a good insight, and that we heard about the different viewpoints. But we have to continue now with the following countries, and I'm come to the Ukraine. We are going to start with the presentation of Professor Andrei Yujashenko, who is a historian. He studied in Kiev, got a doctor's degree there, European policies and Federal Republic of Germany, and he's been a director of the International Institute for History since 2012. He has a broad research field, the people's homicide in the European context, a story of minorities in the Ukraine. So he's a profound, he's a person who has profound knowledge of all these different matters. Please, you have the floor. Dear colleagues, I would like to express my gratitude in particular for this invitation and the possibility you have given me to participate at this meeting. Can you hear me? Yes, we can, yes. It is extremely important that we shed light on the difficulties we have in our countries for minorities. So it's great that we can meet in this context here. I would like to respect the format of this conference, and therefore I'm going to speak in Russian now. Thank you very much for this possibility, because it's going to be a bit easier for me to speak Russian rather than German. Well, the Ukrainian legislation guarantees all citizens the same rights in front of the law, independently from their race, gender, language, religion, ethnicity. The present legal situation also enshrines national minorities, and it comes back to the Constitution of the Ukraine, 1996. In these documents, you can see that there's a definition of the basics, and the constitutional rights and liberties of all citizens is defined independent from their national origin. So the law confirms the right to be able to speak the mother tongue and be taught in it. Mother tongues have to be offered in cultural centers, in schools, and minorities can also use their national symbols, take their national holidays, which does not contradict Ukrainian legislation. Now, according to a survey, and we have 130 different nationalities and groups of people in the Ukraine. You can find them anywhere, but there are specific areas in which they are particularly represented. For example, Hungarians, Slovenes, and Slovaks live in Transcarpathia, Moldavia, and Genesee. Bulgarian and Takauzem live in Esa, and the Polish live in Tomek, Renitsky, and Panev. And then we have the Krim Tatars, who live on the peninsula Crimea. In the Ukraine, every citizen has the right to exercise his and her religion and has his or her opinion. We have all the world religions. The legislation provides also an alternative to military service, so civil service, because of the fact that some of the religions don't permit military services. People can also have their national holidays, and you can express your national identity. The Constitution of the Ukraine, Article 37, prohibits the formation of political parties who would be militant or would promote violence, war, xenophobia, or hate against particular religions, or to counterfeit the rights of other people. Another norm is being defined in Article 4 when it comes to the possibility to form or shape associations and gather in larger groups. According to the Article 55 of the Constitution of our countries, the rights and liberties of the citizens is protected by the legislation. The right to appeal against verdicts made by Court of Justices is possible in case they interfere with these liberties. Then we have the Article 7, in which there is a possibility of the protection of laws and also liberties which can be checked and confirmed by independent Court of Justices. According to the Article 9, the eligibility is based on the principle of equality of all citizens in the Ukraine, independently from political, religious, or other convictions, and also independently from any languages or any of these characteristics. Article 38 of the Constitution of the Ukraine guarantees all citizens the right to address yourself to the public authorities, to elect, to participate at elections, and also to be elected themselves. Now, this article also guarantees that the access to public authorities and to any work, and also to the self-regulations and governance. This right means that all citizens of the Ukraine do get the possibility to realize themselves according to the Constitution and the laws of the Ukraine. Stateless and foreigners living in the Ukraine do not have these rights. They cannot vote or be elected themselves. Well, the legislative basis is a solid, a strong basis for the realization of all the citizens in order to make sure that equality can be guaranteed. According to the Article 53 of the Ukrainian Constitution, citizens who belong to a national minority have a right to be able to study in their mother tongue, or they can also be guaranteed that they can have language lessons in their mother tongues in cultural centers or schools. The basic rights of all these minorities and the guarantee for these liberties are enshrined in the Declaration of the State Sovereignty of the Ukraine, the law about national minorities, and therefore the legislations, such as, for example, the basis of the language policies and the formation of education. Also, they are able to, for the right to assembly, to belong to any association. The larger part of the legislation in the Ukraine also observes and abides by international commitments. the legal document guarantees national minorities the right to a free development. To get a general overview about the situation in the Ukraine, I would like to only go into the following questions. Educational lessons in minority languages, first of all, and secondly, the use of your mother tongue in various areas of public life. When the Ukraine became independent, there were no discussions about the fact that Ukraine and Russian should be dominant. But in fact, in 2001, there was a census of 48 million people. Among these 48 million inhabitants of the Ukraine, we can say that, just to round up these figures, 77% consider themselves to be Ukraine, 17% Russians, and 5% consider themselves to be representatives of other ethnic groups, mother tongues. We have Russian, 98%, and 87% Ukrainian. But among the Russians, we also have 58% of people who also speak Ukraine, Moldavians and White Russians, Hungarians. You also have a large representative percentage of Russian-speaking people. We have the Armenian, Greek people. This means the Ukrainian language is not distributed equally in its presence among minorities. Well, Ukrainian is distributed in the following: in 48% of the educational institutions, in 46% of the public state institutions, 40% of the media. At work, only 13% of all cases, and at daily life in shops and cafeterias, 11%, and in public transport, 2.4%. So we can say that it was quite obvious that the Ukrainian language is more deeply rooted in the daily life. In order to be able to reach the better objective, the legal basis had been changed. New actions was taken to make sure that Ukrainian is spoken, but in accordance with the abiding the right for national minorities. So we have, for example, the law about primary schools, about secondary school, vocational training, and university studies. In order to learn a minority language in the Ukraine, there is a whole series of different kind of educational institutions of different in different levels. Bulgarian, Crim Tatar, New Greek, Polish, Romanian, Slovak, Turkish, Czech, and other languages are offered in these educational institutions. The representatives of minorities, which are distributed in the whole of the country, avail of 400 cultural institutions. In these centers and schools, more than 25 languages are being taught. And I'm not going to name all of them, but just a few. Okay, the speaker is being asked to wind up, as he has been speaking for more than 10 minutes already. Now, the situation has been used by different political parties, and the dependence on political parties has increased. a whole series of laws has been adopted and have been supported in order to make sure that the Ukrainian language be supported as much as also the minority languages should be guaranteed. In 2012, a new law was adopted about the functioning of Ukraine as a state language. And the use of regional languages was restricted at that point. But there is a result of the census which say that up to 10% of the population speak a different language, or have a different language as a mother tongue outside from Ukrainian. Then some decisions were made about the regional status of Russian and other languages apart from Ukrainian. On the 22nd of February 2014, the parliament decided that the law should be abolished, and the president, Turchinov, declared that he doesn't want to sign the abolition of this law as long as there is not a new law to replace the old law. But then the law was finally abolished because it was not considered to be constitutional. Then there was an additional law about the Ukrainian language as a state language in 2019. And it also comprises deadlines and when, or from when date onwards, it should be implemented. And in which area. Well, thank you very much. I think you have given us a good overview about a rather heterogeneous situation in the Ukraine. If you agree, we have a few questions, and we are going to ask this question at the end of the various speakers. But we have a second speaker now.
Well, I believe that the picture will become a little bit clearer when the other speakers have contributed. We are speaking also about the practice, how these laws are implemented in practice, and many thanks. We have a great practitioner, Dr. Olena Bogdan, appointed to the head of State Service of Ukraine for Ethnic Affairs, and since 2020, Dr. Bogdan has a strong academic background in the field of sociology with a special focus on religion, democratization, and subjective well-being studies, as well as social science methodology. I would like to ask you to begin with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
And can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then I can proceed. Dear colleagues, it is an honor and a privilege to participate in this discussion. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share Ukraine's experience on the implementation of minority rights provisions. Before discussing policies, just some brief remarks regarding ethnic composition and language practices. Surveys of the past 5 years show that we have only a small share of population that identify themselves mainly not as Ukrainians. I use the word mainly because we have asked people about multiple identities. Somebody may feel at the same time Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar, Ukrainian and Russian. So we actually have surveys which allow respondents to mark multiple identities. At the same time, this small share who identify themselves ethnically as mainly some other identity, not Ukrainian, is very diverse. It includes over 100 identities. Among the most numerous groups, we have Crimean Tatars, Romani, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Moldovans and Romanians, Greeks, Gagauz people, and others. On the map, which is currently on the slide, we can see approximate geographical distribution of minority languages speakers across Ukraine. The vast majority of speakers of national minority languages are concentrated in the temporarily occupied Crimea, certain districts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, in the southern part of Odessa region, in the part of Chernivtsi and Zakarpattia regions. During the Soviet times, when the Russian language was promoted and enforced as the state language, a number of minorities have basically lost their native language as a language of everyday use, and instead started to use Russian mainly. At the same time, both at times of the Tsarist Russia and in the Soviet times, Ukrainians in the center, south, and east of Ukraine had more opportunities to learn Russian than Ukrainian. The consequences of such language policies are still felt nowadays in Ukraine. So we actually have a rather unusual situation when language practices might not coincide actually with the ethnic identity or even with language preferences. Like, for example, the fluency in the language might not necessarily mean that this is the language for which a person would prefer a book or a movie. Two more brief comments before we proceed to policy overviews. Crimean Peninsula and part of Ukraine's eastern territory are currently occupied, and the Ukrainian government cannot bear responsibility for the occupying powers' violation of minority rights in these territories. I'm making this comment since we already had some misunderstandings when there is a report listing violations in Ukraine, but then when you look at the violations, it turns out it is about occupied territories. And also, please kindly note that information on ethnic identity in Ukraine is collected by state authorities only during the national census. And at the same time, ethnic identity data can be freely collected through anonymous surveys, but not in the state documentation regarding a particular person. Several remarks about current institutional capacity, like which are actually the agencies through which we implement policies regarding minority rights. The State Service of Ukraine for Ethnic Affairs and Freedom of Conscience, which I represent, are focusing on monitoring and analysis, on dialogue and mediation, and on policy suggestions. At the same time, we have Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, which provides grants to various projects. And at the same time, we have Coordination Center for National Minority Broadcasting. All three institutions mentioned are supported by public funding. Education. Let us have a look at some data on education in minority languages. In the pie chart, which is currently on the screen, you can see the distribution of classes with national minority languages as languages of instruction. For those classes which are in a certain language, one language, the majority, more than 5,000, are classes with Russian as a language of instruction. And there is also a sizable share of classes in Hungarian and Romanian languages. Besides the classes, over 7,000 classes you see on the pie chart, in addition, there are over 15,000 classes where at least two languages are used, one of them often being the state language. This approach helps integration of society while preserving the diversity of languages and identities. The government annually provides students of public schools with publicly funded textbooks in the languages of national minorities and indigenous peoples. For example, in 2020, more than 200,000 copies were printed and distributed in Russian, more than 31,000 in Hungarian, and around 28,000 in Romanian. Also, other less populous minorities are provided with publicly funded textbooks, such as Bulgarians, Crimean Tatars, Greeks, Gagauz people, Jews. So the government supports textbooks in a variety of languages. We can also use the information for final school exams in minority languages as an illustration of how government implements its policies. Graduates are allowed to take their graduation exams in their language of instruction, which is often the native language of their national minority. In 2020, about 7% of graduates asked for a translated math test, and on this demand, the government provided more than 12,000 copies of it in Russian, around 350 in Hungarian, 56 in Moldovan, 51 in Romanian, and 9 in Polish. Public broadcasting. As I mentioned, Ukraine has Coordination Center for National Minority Broadcasting, which is a state-owned public broadcasting company. The center is part of a state-owned public broadcasting company. It works in several regional offices, and it produces programs in the languages of national minorities and also for national minorities of Ukraine, meaning that it adapts certain programs targeted for the information which would be of interest for national minorities. And at the same time, this coordination center produces programs which would be targeted at the widest audience possible, showing the life of various national minorities in Ukraine. In 2020, 7 national and 12 regional programs were launched by this Coordination Center for National Minority Broadcasting. If we look at some data for national minority languages in public broadcasting and on air, we see that we have multiple of languages in several regional stations. For example, in Zakarpattia, there are programs in German, Hungarian, Slovak, Romanian, and Romanian. In Odessa, Bulgarian, Gagauz, and Moldovan, and in Chernivtsi, Romanian. So we have a number of programs in a number of languages. Of course, it is quite difficult in modern times to compete with programs from abroad. For example, when we have a program in Romanian or Hungarian, at the same time, there are also a variety of TV channels from Hungary and from Romania available. However, what makes programs produced in Ukraine special is that it is about local news, about actually events that are happening in Ukraine within this ethnic community. Political participation. Basically, we can highlight 2 aspects. On the one hand, all state administrations in the region with large proportions of national minorities have special advisory councils of representatives of national minorities and indigenous peoples. Also, similar bodies work with central governmental agencies. For example, there is a respective advisory council at the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine. At the same time, needless to say, each citizen has the right to run for the elections, to vote at any level of state administration, or to become a public servant. And we can see that the representatives of national minorities and indigenous peoples are regularly elected to the parliament or councils at various levels. And the cabinet of ministers also has people who have a strong identity other than ethnically Ukrainian. Due to the restrictions on ethnic data collection, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we are not able actually to say exactly and to mark exactly, but since a number of parliament members, of public officials, they sometimes mention their roots, their identities, we can claim for certain that minorities are represented in public offices, and this can be said about both those minorities who have been in Ukraine for a very long time and those who could be considered more of recent arrivals, like, for example, Afghan minority, which could be considered as relatively new in Ukraine, but one of the most well-known MPs in Ukraine.
Many thanks. You mentioned Hungarians. I think it's a very good link to the next presentation. I think maybe you can have your further thoughts in the discussion later on, because we have to adhere to the time restrictions. And thank you first of all. And we would like to have Mr. Istvan Chernyshov, who is a linguist and since 2013. He is the author of several publications on the language policy of the Ukraine, and especially with the language of Hungarian minorities, and maybe he can then connect to the previous presentation. So please, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
And thank you for this opportunity. I am honored to be part of such in this conference. In the last few years, the Ukrainian government has passed several laws restricting the language rights of minorities. These policy decisions have many consequences in everyday life. In 1996, 2010, and 2016, we surveyed a sociologically representative sample of Hungarians living in Transcarpathia on the language or languages used in the administration of local governments. An informant could indicate more than one language. As we can see, in the first year after the collapse of Soviet Union, very few people used the Hungarian language in this situation. It can also be seen that slightly more people use the Russian language than Ukrainian. In 2010 and 2016, the use of the Russian language decreased significantly, and the choice of Hungarian and Ukrainian increased. However, after the adoption of the law of Ukraine on supporting the functioning of the Ukrainian language as the state language, the use of the Hungarian language will be excluded from local governments. Article 12 of the law only allows the use of the state language in the work of local governments. The first language law of Ukraine permitted the use of minority languages in addition to the state language in the work of municipalities where the proportion of minority representatives exceeded 50%. The language law of 2012 allowed the use of minority languages in the work of local governments where minority language speakers reached 10%. In 2010, 53. In 2015, 76 local governments were visited by us, where according to the laws in force, it was possible to use the Hungarian language in the work of local governments. In each settlement, we asked local representatives whether citizens could submit applications in Hungarian to the mayor or the representative body. The results show that in 2010, 56%, 5 years later, already 75% of the surveyed municipalities provided this opportunity to tax-paying citizens. However, the law on the protection of the state language adopted in 2019 no longer allows the use of minority languages in the work of local governments. The Venice Commission has been severely critical of this law. The Committee of Experts of the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages last examined in 2017 how Ukraine is meeting its commitments when ratifying the Charter. The committee assessed the fulfillment of the commitments on a 4-point scale as shown below. Already in 2017, 2 years before the adoption of the law on the state language, The International Committee found that Ukraine had fulfilled its international obligations to the Council of Europe to a very small extent when it ratified the Charter. It is clear that after the entry into force of the state language law, the Ukrainian government will not be able, and most likely will not want to comply with the Charter for the protection of minority languages. When Transcarpathia became part of the Soviet Union after World War II, Ukrainian education continued uninterrupted, but Hungarian secondary schools could only open in 1953 after Stalin's death. From then on, however, Hungarians of Transcarpathia could study in their mother tongue, in Hungarian, from the first grade until graduation. Both Ukrainians and Hungarians had the right to choose the language of instruction of Soviet Ukraine. Ukraine became an independent state in 1991. The new state continued to guarantee the right to mother tongue medium education for minorities. From 1991 to the present day, the Hungarian medium education system has been constantly evolving, and today there are 100 schools with Hungarian as the language of instruction in Ukraine, where more than 17,000 children can study in their mother tongue. However, new laws passed after 2017 restrict the appearance of the Hungarian language in education. From 2021, Russian language schools have been abolished, and from 2023, from the 5th grade onwards, more and more subjects will be required to be taught in Ukrainian in schools that still teach in Hungarian at the moment. As early as 2017, the Committee of Experts of the Charter noted that Ukraine had not fulfilled its international obligations in the field of education even before the adoption of the new laws in education. It is clear that after the adoption of the new laws, Kyiv will no longer be able and probably will not want to fulfill its obligations to the European community. Those who visit Transcarpathia today can see bilingual place name plates on the outskirts of many towns and villages. There are Ukrainian, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Romanian, but also Ukrainian German things. Unfortunately, however, Article 41 of the state language law only allows the use of the state language. Bilingual things will disappear. This is the text of the Article 41. Today, we can see bilingual signage in more than 100 settlements in Transcarpathia. Among them, there are Ukrainian-Hungarian things, but in some villages, there are also inscriptions in Ukrainian and German. However, according to the state language law, even street name things can only be monolingual. Of course, only in Ukraine. The post of Commissioner for the Protection of the State Language was created under the state language law. Currently, Taras Kremin holds this position, sometimes referred to in the press as Sprachenführer. Why? Let's look at what he posted on April 16 on his official and public Facebook page. Taking pride that Article 30 of the state language law has only been in force for 3 months, but there already has been more than 1,000 complaints. The state language law wants to protect the state language by treating citizens with severe fines if the provisions of the law are not complied with. In this connection, it is worth noting that one of the complaints received by the commissioner is that in Hungarian school in Beroe, the children's Christmas celebration was not organized in Ukrainian, but in Hungarian. While the Ukrainian government wants to push back the appearance of the Hungarian language in education, people are demanding education in the Hungarian language. In recent years, thousands of people have applied for our Hungarians as a foreign language courses in almost 50 settlements in Transcarpathia. The need for education in Hungarian is indicated by the fact that 2 weeks ago, the Commissioner for the Protection of the State Language launched an investigation because the child of one of the Ukrainian-speaking parents was not admitted to Hungarian language kindergarten. However, the Commissioner did not complain about the lack of space in Hungarian kindergarten groups in Vinohradiv, but wanted to expose the alleged discrimination against Ukrainian native speakers. An enormous problem is that in Ukraine, the language issue is highly politicized. The use of Ukrainian language is treated as an ethical issue. Posters like this, as we can see here, suggest that all those who do not use the Ukrainian language are potential enemies and endanger the security of state.
We have a number of questions in the chat, and perhaps we should start.
Question for Ms. Olena Bogdan. Several minority-related provisions of the 2017 education law and the 2019 state language law have far-reaching implications for national minorities. They have been criticized by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and by the Venice Commission. A possibility to correct these concerning provisions would be the adoption of a balanced framework law on the rights of national minorities. Are there any developments in this regard? Eine Frage von Herrn Roman Roblek.
Well, there are actually there is quite a lot of work on the new legislation regarding national minorities. However, it looks like there are some misunderstandings. First of all, it is not like the law on the functioning of the Ukrainian language as the state language kind of makes other languages disappear. It states that Ukrainian language is the default language of communication. However, if the person requests communication in another language and the other person knows it, I mean, obligation not to use a different language. At the same time, regarding the quotas in school, I'm sorry, I have to react to the presentation because it was referring to 2021. As to the Hungarian language, for implementation of quotas is 2023, and the quotas were introduced so that to ensure that each child which received publicly funded education is then free to enter any university in Ukraine, to enter any profession, and doesn't have a language barrier. We would like our citizens to have equal opportunities when it comes to higher education and professional development. Thank you.
Hasn't the entire minority policy of Ukraine in the last 30 years been guided by the basic idea of Korenizatsiya? It has the creation of an ethnically homogeneous nation state. The parallel between the current law of language and the Lex Gentile from Mussolini's time in 1923, 1924 is striking.
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Of course, there are parallels to what you said about Mussolini and Italy. The national policies in the Ukraine have the objective of restricting the rights of national minorities, and I've given you a few examples which underline this development. As far as Hungarian is concerned, until 2023, we still have time until then to teach in Hungarian, but this is only 2 years. and many more subjects are going to be taught in Ukrainian only. But even during the Soviet times, we had the right to have our educational system in Hungarian. And this is an example for the fact that the Ukraine is now trying to create a homogeneous society with just one language.
Why do Romanians, Poles, Bulgarians and Gagauz not receive the status of an indigenous minority like the Crimean Tatars? With the exception of the Poles, these settle in mostly small, compact regions and have an educational system that has grown over the centuries, which is not being destroyed by the language and minority laws. It's now being destroyed.
Why don't these groups get a justified right? Okay, I'm going to try to answer this question, and maybe we should have a look at the broader picture. It concerns the Targos, but also many other minorities which are low in numbers. But these people have been living in their territories for a long time. Very often it depends on the number of people, whether the Ukraine offers educational possibilities. But without any doubt, this is a very modern question. We all have to do something about it, our politicians, our scientists, and I think optimal a solution should be found. I'd like to give you my view on the problem, maybe from a broader and more philosophical perspective. What do I mean? Colleague Mr. Yujashenko said quite rightfully that during the Soviet times, and we can compare it today, education in minority languages was possible. In Soviet times, a lot of directives and documents existed which protected minority languages. And they were mostly in favor. However, Russian was the vehicular language for the whole big nation of the Soviet Union. When the Ukraine got its independence, there were many legislative acts which referred to the former Soviet laws. But in practice, however, when I carried out scientific work in the 90s and I made research in the colonization myself in order to find out what it looked like in reality, I came to the following conclusions. The Ukrainian language will prevail upon all the other languages once the Ukrainian language becomes a vehicular language. But the politicians make a mistake in demanding this immediately. You can't just impose it from one day to the other. It doesn't work like that. Like, let's have a look at the space travel, the beginning of space travel. There was a first stage when the astronauts, when they flew into space, they had to spend the same time on Earth once they came back in order to get adapted against towards gravity and to get used to gravity once again when they came back. The Russification took place, but it lasted longer. And it lasted longer. And of course, there were several reasons for that, legislative reasons. Today, we can see that there is a strong will to Ukrainize And the way Ukrainian and Russian is being used, we can realize that politicians demand an immediate change from one day to the other. And that's not really possible. We can't do it that way. But a lot of resources are being spent on this project. But let's be honest, how many resources do we have? Okay, we have the Togosian language, Caucasian language. How come? What possibilities does the government have to actually promote the teaching of these languages? Very well. I think we got a very comprehensive, nice picture about the Ukraine. I think we have to come to the next country reports, which is Bulgaria. And in this context, first of all, Dr. Poparov is professor of sociology in the Bulgarian sciences, and since October 2016, he is a member of the Asylum Committee in the Republic of Bulgaria. You have the floor, please. Go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me the chance to give this speech. It's a very important issue, and here what I'm going to talk about are the frame of the debate that you said, the political participation, language education, and language use on public life. But before that, some very important notice on the legal definitions. Bulgaria does not recognize the national minorities, and there was a in the constitutional court there was a case about even denouncing the framework convention, but then the court said that they found that it's in line with Article 6 that we don't need to recognize national minorities in order to respect the individual rights of the people. So, as the Ukrainian colleague speaker previously said, is the same case in Bulgaria. We does not regard this as a legal term or like a community law, but like an individual law. At the individual level, the ethnic identity, self-identity, freedom of speech are respected. The only thing which is forbidden is that shall not be a political party on ethnic or religiously based. Additionally to the Constitution, we have a Protection Against Discrimination Act, where again nationality, ethnicity, and citizenship are explicitly mentioned as no discrimination, that there should not be discrimination based on these features. So by law, by legal definitions, by legal understanding in the country, that's the legal frame. Everybody is free to speak and sustain, develop, and use their language. The state should encourage the representation, participation, etc. You will see later on what's the reality compared to the legal frame. Bulgaria is, according to the constitution, is one nation state, but with multiple ethnicities inside. Only the census is the official source of figures about the ethnicity of the people. Here on the left table with the blue is presented the population distribution of the population by mother tongue, and the definition of the mother tongue is the first language learned at home at early childhood. Because sometimes in some surveys, in some other definitions, global definitions, the mother tongue is the language most spoken at home. Here in the national census, the definition is a bit different. We have two strange languages, Valachian, which is not existing language, but it's a kind of way to express the existence of Romanian and Ludari languages. They're a kind of patois of Romanian, but it's different from Romanian. And then there is a Jewish language declared in the census, which in fact stays for Ladino and Yiddish. Mostly Ladino. Most of the Jews in Bulgaria are Ladino speakers, belong to so-called Sephardim community. But there are some small Ashkenazim community as well. So there are also Yiddish speakers. We have huge problems both with the ethnicity and with the language self-identity. You can see about 10% of the population simply don't answer the question, refuse to answer the question, or don't declare identity. This issue comes because the census questionnaire, it's very restrictive. You cannot declare different specific ethnicity as Gagauzwar, for example, or Pomak. You are forced to declare that you are Bulgarian Mohammedan. It's quite crazy definition. And for example, you cannot declare that you are Ludari. You should say that you are Romani person, or you are Romanian, or you are Bulgarian. You cannot say you are Ludari. It's kind of this Romanian dialect speaking population, let's say it like this, who many people consider being Roma, but they do not consider themselves Roma mostly. And also the case of Millet community. I know most of you know a lot of strange figures for Roma people in Bulgaria, and it's a huge issue because the umbrella term of European Commission and of European Union puts under this definition, for example, Millet people who are Turkish speakers, who usually define themselves as Turks and belong to this 5 or almost 600,000 people. So it's a very tricky issue if you follow the Romani activism, or if you follow the Turkish activism, and they're most how to say, voiceless, with the stronger voice of among other communities. So the small communities like Gagauzwar, which are Turkish speaker but Christian Orthodox, for example, in Bulgaria, or Pomaks, which are Sunni Muslims but Bulgarian speakers. It's a very complex, and they simply disappear from the national census, and it reflects in this denial to declare identity. What about the political participation? I say that it's forbidden to have political parties, but the case here is that the Turkish party was established before the constitution. It was established as an act after the fall of the communist regime and before the new constitution. So after the constitution was accepted, there was a case in the constitutional court, and the finally constitutional court said that yes, it's established as a Turkish party, but now it's framed as a liberal party, and they changed the act of establishment. Currently, it's definitely not officially Turkish party, but people still call it like this. The Turkish population, most of it votes for this party, and you can see the regions from the just last elections. Just less than a month ago, there were elections in Bulgaria. This is the regions with the highest proportion of Turkish population, Turkish-speaking population, and that's the outcome, voting outcomes, the turnouts of the vote. It's for this party. It's the highest for this party in these regions, simply because they are considered as a Turkish, not only by majority but also by Turkish minority. So the Turkish minority is somehow represented by this party, although this party is member of ALDE and it's not officially Turkish one. And it's permanently, they have a permanently representative in the parliament. They were even 3 times in the ruling coalitions, so being in the government. So we can say that the Turks are not discriminated as political participation in Bulgaria. The strange case with the Turkish party make a kind of a precedent anyway. So there are about 29 Romani parties registered, although not officially Romani parties, but some of them still keep the name Roma, and you can see that Roma Democratic Union, Confederation of Roma People, Euro Roma, United Roma, Roma Party, Roma Drum, Roma Pirin. A lot of parties are even in their name. It's clearly that it's a Romani party. And some names which are connotation of Romanipe, of the Romaniness, Romanihood. So it's like 8th of April or drum parties. So there are also Romani political parties from that perspective. They're also somehow participating in the political life, but they never won place in the parliament. They never get to have a member of the parliament by these Romani parties, but only in coalitions, and they're very active in the local elections. On the table are presented the number of Romani members of the parliament in the parliaments. The last two members of the parliament in the 43rd parliament are on the pictures on the left. I just wanted to show you the way how if you want to become a member of the parliament, if you want to be somehow recognized, you are starting from the Romani party, then both of them move to a biggest parties, like the biggest left and biggest right parties, but finally they arrived in the Turkish or in the minority party in order to have a successful career. So this change is forced somehow, because people simply don't vote for Romani parties, and when they're in the list of the biggest parties, they're on the bottom of the ballot, so they never have chance to get in the parliament. So that's why they moved to the MRF. And what happens with the Romani parties in the local elections? They was very successful in the 2003 and 2007. A lot of parties very active, but on the last elections there was no single Romani party active, and no single Romani member of local parliament as Romani party. They are Romani members of the local parliaments, but they became members of other parties, mainly of the so-called Turkish one, of the MRF, some of the Socialist Party, some of the Christian Democratic Party. But anyway, to have their own party, their own initiative was very unsuccessful, and it's a very regional. I'm showing you this picture, but if you get the picture from 2003 or 11, it's almost the same region. So the Romani parties, as the Turkish party, it's a very regional. It's based on the regions with concentration of Romani population as a proportion of the population at all. Language education, because of some funding requirements of European Union, some frame conventions, some pressure from the European Commission, National Statistical Institute and the governments are producing fake data. I'm saying it openly, this, and it's became more open since after our 2 monitoring reports, which I produced once as academician from Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and once in Civil Society Coalition. Finally, they stopped faking the data, but they simply stopped showing any data. What does it mean? That means that under the label Hebrew, they put a lot of students which are simply not. It's not their mother tongue. It's simply students who are interested in Hebrew language and study it at school. There is a school in Sofia with this, and it's not only mother tongue speakers. Moreover, I once again want to mention this, that Hebrew is not the mother tongue of the Jewish communities in Bulgaria. It's the holy language of the synagogues. They preach in this language, But at home they speak Ladino or Yiddish or Bulgarian. Most of them speak Bulgarian. The Jewish people who decided to stay in Bulgaria after establishment of Israeli state, most of them were very well integrated. There are a lot of mixed marriages. So the language spoken at home is rather Bulgarian or some of Ladino or Yiddish, not the Hebrew. Second thing is Romanes. There are no officially Romanes classes in any school. They have no been. There are some civic.
Wir müssen jetzt fast unterbrechen, weil die Zeit überschritten ist und wir hätten noch einen weiteren Referenten.
Yeah.
Wenn
just one slide and I'm ending. 1 minute, please. Yep.
Bitte, ja.
Okay. So in the public field, the language is open. It's not because in the communist era it was forbidden to use Romani or Turkish in the public field. There are newspapers in the services, even in the pop folk music, and we have a very famous singer singing in Romani. What I would like to say here, together with the thank you for your attention, is that we have problem with other minority rights, and they're more deeper problem than the language and political participation, with evictions, with the healthcare, with segregation, and with the hate crimes, the killings of Roma people. And it's problem not only in Bulgaria, also in other Eastern and Central European countries. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, many thanks. That was a very extensive speech. And the next speaker is Mr. Dr. Lashev. He's a senior diplomat in the Human Rights Directorate of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bulgaria. We have very little time, so we would be grateful if you would keep to your 10 minutes. Many thanks. Please go ahead.
To thank the FUEN and the Kulturstiftung for organizing this important online conference. What has been said by Dr. Pamporov, that under the constitution and domestic law of Bulgaria, there are no national minorities, but rather ethnic groups and minority groups, is the real situation on the ground. Bulgaria adheres to the concept that the protection of minority groups is effectively ensured by fully guaranteeing the individual rights and freedoms of persons belonging to those groups. Let me present to you some issues related to the political participation of minority groups in Bulgaria. Article 11, paragraph 4 of the Constitution proclaims that political parties cannot be formed on ethnic, racial, or religious grounds. This constitutional provision does not hinder the rights of Bulgarian citizens belonging to ethnic minority groups to participate actively in the political life in conformity with their own beliefs and interests while respecting the laws of the country. Representatives of ethnic minority groups are members of the major political parties, the Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria, that there is such a nation party, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, the Rights and Freedoms Movement, etc., and take part in the management bodies and activities of these parties. The policy of the Bulgarian state is constantly aimed at providing legal guarantees and real opportunities for all Bulgarian citizens without discrimination to vote in the presidential, parliamentary, municipal elections and elections for members of the European Parliament, and to be elected to bodies of state and local governments and the European Parliament. With reference to the notion ethnic groups and minority groups in Bulgaria that have been clarified by Dr. Pampulov, I would like to explain that there is no legal basis for the use of term minority language, which has to be replaced by the term mother tongue. The teaching in mother tongue and study of mother tongue in Bulgaria is not conditional on any recognition of particular minority group, but rather a matter of individual will of the persons concerned. Teaching in Armenian in Hebrew is offered to pupils attending Saturday and Sunday schools in Sofia, Plovdiv, Burgas, Rus, and other cities and towns. Article 36, paragraph 2 of the Bulgarian Constitution provides that citizens whose mother tongue is not Bulgarian shall have the right to study and use their own language alongside the compulsory study of the Bulgarian language. The government encourages the study of languages, cultures, and religions present in the country. The existing legal framework of the preschool and school education system creates conditions for equal access to education to all children and students, regardless of their ethnic origin. Normative requirements are established in support of activities related to the education process of children and students for whom the Bulgarian language is not a mother tongue. The study of mother tongue is possible in all Bulgarian schools in the form of obligatory eligible subject and or freely eligible subject. The only requirement is that parents file an application for the particular language with the school administration. The textbooks are free of charge. The strategy for the educational integration of children and pupils belonging to ethnic minority groups, approved in 2004 and updated in 2010, outlines various initiatives for the study of mother tongue, Romani, Turkish, Armenian, Hebrew, and others. Teaching Romani began in some municipal schools in 1992. Turkish is being studied as a mother tongue both in municipal and private schools. Armenian and Hebrew are studied as mother tongues in schools in Sofia, Plovdiv, Sliven, and other cities and towns. There is a specialized high school with intensive study of Hebrew, the Dimchu Debelează School in Sofia, where 1/3 of the pupils are Jewish and the rest Bulgarian. The Romanian language is studied at the specialized high school with intensive study of Romanian language, Mihai Eminescu in Sofia, where 2/3 of the pupils are of Vlah or Romanian origin and the rest are Bulgarians. These two examples clearly demonstrate that mother tongue classes are not provided on the basis of ethnic affiliation only, but in fact they are taken by representatives of other ethnic groups as well. One of the priorities of the strategic framework for development of education, training, and study in the Republic of Bulgaria 2021-2030 is full inclusion of pupils and students of minority groups in the educational and training process, including through study of mother tongue. Let me touch upon a number of issues related to the use of languages of minority groups in public life. In line with the Constitution, the election code provides for election campaign to be conducted in Bulgarian. The requirement applies to the official statement of the parties, their leaders, and activists during the campaign and does not affect normal discussions among persons belonging to minority groups, including on election topics. Pursuant to Article 3, Article 36, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution, and Judgment 2 of 1992 of the Constitutional Code, the language which the law prescribes as the official one is also the language in which all Bulgarian citizens may communicate with the administration. In order to accommodate Bulgarian citizens or residents in the country whose command of Bulgarian language does not permit them to maintain such communications with the authorities provide translators and interpreters as well as informal service. Bulgarian authorities take appropriate measures to provide various ethnic groups with radio and television broadcasting in their mother tongue. The regional format of the Bulgarian National Radio regularly offers programs in Turkish. The Bulgarian National Television offers daily programs in Turkish and broadcasts various programs dedicated to ethnic groups. Private cable television providers offer programming in Armenian, Greek, Romanian, Turkish, and Serbian, with the availability of the programming depending on the need of the local population. Mr. Moderator, I have addressed some of the main issues related to the protection of the rights of persons belonging to minority groups in Bulgaria, and now I look forward to answering to the questions which you, the esteemed panelists, and other participants might pose. Before concluding, I wish to respond to what has been said by our Ukrainian colleague, Professor Istvan Chernychenko, that there are no tradition of Bulgarian educational institutions in Ukraine. I cannot agree with that statement in view of the fact that after the movement of Bulgarian population to the territory which is now in Ukraine at the end of 18th and 19th century and in the beginning of 19th century, Bulgarians moved with their churches and their schools. I would like to underscore that in 1859, in the city of Belgrade, this is 250 kilometers to southwest of Odessa, the first Bulgarian gymnasium, secondary school, with the name of Georgi Sava Rakovsky was founded. This gymnasium was graduated by a great number of Bulgarians who, after the liberation of Bulgaria 20 years, almost 20 years later, became ministers, generals, leading intellectuals. So there are long-standing traditions of Bulgarian educational traditions in Ukraine. And I believe that there will be good understanding among our friends from Ukraine. I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, there is one question to Mr. Pamperov.
Are the Pomak minority also mostly part of the so-called Turkish party?
Yes, a lot of Pomaks are members of the MRF, and they belong. We even observe a change of identity in some regions toward Turkish. Some Pomaks, because of the Sunni religion and the prestigious and activity of MRF, become and start self-identifying them as Turks. So there is such a process observed in the Rhodopa Mountains mainly. Yes.
For Dr. Lashev, what are the three main challenges that Bulgaria's minorities face today?
It depends on the minority. I have to say, the different minorities are facing different challenges, and the Roma minority is facing the hate speech and hate crimes, and the huge segregation in Bulgaria. The other minorities are facing different issues. The Romanian minority.
Ich würde auch sagen, das ist sicherlich kontextbezogen zu beurteilen.
Many thanks. I will be brief, and many thanks to Mr. Hilpold. So on behalf of the FUN, I would like to thank all the speakers for their excellent contributions. Unfortunately, this was the last day of our series of conference about the minority protection and of ethnic groups and rights in Central and Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, because and my colleagues and myself have enjoyed very much to be present, and we have learned a lot. And it shows also how important it is to have these conferences. And together with the Cultural Foundation, the FUN has intended to highlight the situation of the national minorities, and with a comparative study to come to conclusions. And FUN sees its roles to be a platform and mediator for all the members when it's about strengthening the rights of minorities. But all these presentations that we've had in the framework of this series today and before will also be published in a scientific publication, and will be presented to the political world and also to science. So we can demonstrate the situation. I also wanted to mention it briefly. We talked about minority safeback, And the conference shows how different and complex the situation of minorities is in Europe. And therefore, I think it's still important to implement Minority Safeback Initiative. And we heard also that we have put a charge forward against the decision of the Commission, and we are quite convinced that it can be successful, and we find common guidelines for protection of minorities on an EU level. And we hope for your support, for your further support with this initiative. But at last, there's always thank you to those who have enabled this event. So the Federal Ministry of Interior of the Republic of Germany, and also the Prime Minister of Hungary. And so these were my final words, and I would like to wish you a nice evening, all the best, and I would like to hand back the floor to my colleague, Mr. Kronhäuser. Many thanks, Mrs. Penches, and I would like to agree with your words and thank to all the speakers in October, in February, and now, and in April, who were moderators, presenters, but all those who said their welcome words, and of course all the speakers and moderators who contributed shows that the importance of minority protection, and that it's of highest importance. And Mrs. Benches before the meeting and is after the meeting. So I think it's very important to continue this series of events, of meetings. After we had the country focus, maybe we can have a specific symposium on minority protection. And next to literary history, art history, and contemporary history, I think we had state and ethnic rights in focus, and it's also been a focus of our foundation. After the 90s, we've had many important meetings regarding minority protections and published important publications. So thank you also to the study group Policy and Ethnic Rights at University of Marburg, and thank you to the FUN for the great cooperation. Thank you to all of your team from my side, and a great thank you to the Federal Ministry of Interior to enable this enormously important series of conferences and to finance it, and also to the Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Stefan Mayer. And therefore, I hope that we will see each other again very soon and continue this series of conferences. And I wish you all a nice evening and a nice couple of days, and stay healthy.